Hey fellas, it's March.
This is Stephen Colbert back in March 2010.
That means it's time for the year's most exciting television event. Say it with me. The Texas School Board hearings. Why did you say it with me?
Back then, Colbert poked a lot of fun at the Texas State Board of Education. The board sets educational standards textbook makers have to follow. And books written to satisfy Texas were showing up in other states.
That's why most sex ed books have chapters on the reproductive system, abstinence, and how to castrate a steer.
When Colbert was ribbing the Texas State Board, they were in the process of updating the state's social studies curriculum standards. The board was dominated by conservatives, and it had been getting criticism in the national media for revising history.
For instance, they proposed changing slave trade to the less judgmental Atlantic triangular trade, so our children might one day know the heartbreaking truth that our cotton was once harvested by triangles of color. Or, as they prefer to be called, isosceles Americans.
I'm Trey Kay, and this is Us and Them from West Virginia Public Broadcasting. It's the podcast where we tell stories from America's cultural divides. Texas students will be back in school soon, and they're going to crack open some brand new social studies textbooks. The books are the result of fierce fights over what kids should learn in school. Lots of American school districts struggle with this question, but nobody fights like Texans. Over the past half century, Texas has had some legendary showdowns over the teaching of evolution, abstinence versus comprehensive sex education, and even a fight over an algebra book that some conservatives believed was sending a leftist environmentalist message. The new textbooks kids will be reading this fall are based on standards set in 2010, the standards Stephen Colbert was making fun of. But some Texans aren't laughing.
The social studies education Texas students get today is worse than it would have been had the Texas State Board of Education not done everything in their power to whitewash American history and to insert their own personal political beliefs into the curriculum standards and textbooks.
This is Kathy Miller. She's the president of the Texas Freedom Network. It's an organization formed back in the mid-90s to battle the religious right in Texas. They keep an eye on the Texas State Board of Education.
We have a State Board of Education member who has gone on the record saying that critical thinking is gobbledygook.
This board member championed social studies standards that Kathy Miller disagreed with. For example, one standard says children should be taught that the causes of the Civil War were sectionalism, states' rights, and slavery. To Kathy Miller, this seems like a deliberate downplaying of slavery's role.
In fact, right, states' rights, the right the states were fighting for was the right to buy and sell human beings in an evil institution of slavery. And that disconnect between what students learn and the reality behind the causes of the Civil War has led to a great deal of misunderstanding about the Confederacy in the population of the South today. The country is embroiled in a conversation about whether the Confederate flag is flying over courthouses and whether or not Confederate statues should be honored as heroes in Southern public spaces. And one of the reasons that we're having this conversation in 2015 is that for many students in our public schools, especially in the South, they were taught that the Confederacy was fighting for states' rights, and it was taught as a noble cause. So we need to eradicate that problem. We need to start in our public schools, and we need to teach the truth about what the causes of the Civil War were and what the outcome of slavery has been and continues to be in our country.
Slavery is mentioned in there. It's in our textbooks. Slavery, of course, was the underlying cause for some of the great differences between the North and the South.
This is Dr. Don McElroy.
I was on the State Board of Education back in 2010 when we adopted the standards the new textbooks were written to.
Dr. McElroy is a dentist from the Bryan College Station area. He likes the standards his board passed, and he likes the textbooks that are based on those standards. And he's chafed about a recent Washington Post article that criticizes how Texans teach children about the cause of the Civil War.
Because the only reason we're having this podcast today is because of Emma Brown, a reporter for the Washington Post. The story that she wrote, you talk about sloppy journalism. The way she wrote her story led to the misinterpretation that we weren't even including Jim Crow, we weren't including the KKK.
Because the implication being that the Texas State Board is wanting to kind of sweep that part of the history under the carpet.
Exactly, and that's exactly not what happened. If you, the thing that bothers me about so many people on the left is how they're so uninformed. And I want to say Emma Brown is uninformed. The Washington Post editorial board's uninformed. They need to read the standards. They need to read all the standards. You ought to see the standards. I have them with me. That talk about the civil rights struggle, that talk about slavery.
Dr. McElroy believes articles, like the one in the Post, are driven by anti-Christian bigotry. He says conservatives like him have gotten a raw deal in the mainstream media and from late-night comedians.
But the biggest victory of all, folks, was that in the curriculum on great revolutionary thinkers, board members removed any reference to Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence. You see, Jefferson coined the term separation of church and state. So Texas has coined the term separation of Jefferson and history.
They were poking fun at some of the standards that you adopted. What did you think of that?
Well, I thought it was sad, actually. I think it's a pretty serious problem, actually.
McElroy says that the board never tried to kick Jefferson out of the curriculum. They removed him from a list of the world's great thinkers, but kids still would have learned about him in lessons about the Founding Fathers. After the public uproar about Jefferson, the board put him back on the list of great thinkers. And McElroy says that the media got another thing wrong. Media accounts said the standards exaggerate the role that Christianity played in the founding of the nation.
For me, it's a simple little thing to do. It's just to go to the opening paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. And you see that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Well, if you look at that, it says there's truth, that man is created in the image of God. It says the world's created. When we look at secular principles, they say there is no truth, we just evolved, and that there is no God. So the principles of our Declaration, which is the foundational statement of our country, is clearly founded on biblical principles.
But I didn't hear, and I don't see anywhere in the Constitution or in the Declaration of Independence any reference to Christ or the Bible or anything that is identifiably Christian.
Yes, I'd agree with you. Of course it's not mentioned, but the principles on which it's founded are not secular principles. We're a secular state founded on religious principles.
Just to sharpen the point a bit, but that may be religious principles, but not necessarily Christian principles.
Well, they're biblical principles. I think that to be more accurate terms. They're biblical principles. Every principle I just gave you is found right there in the opening chapter of the Bible. Well, the fact that there's a creator, we're created in the image of God, and just the fact that there is a Bible implies that there's truth.
McElroy and his allies fought to have Moses included in the standards as a thinker who inspired the Founding Fathers. In fact, he wishes the standards and the textbooks went farther in emphasizing the importance of Christianity.
What separates the West from everything else is the religious conviction man has been created in the image of God. And those things I don't think are fully understood. If we could just teach what actually happened in the past, the great contributions of Christendom, the weeding out of slavery, all this has a lot to do with our religious convictions and has to do with our religious beliefs. So that's the one thing I would like to see added or make sure that's understood. And that's one of the reasons I like your podcast. You have the opportunity to speak to a lot of people that maybe haven't thought about that.
If you read the curriculum standards, you might conclude that Mount Sinai's in Philadelphia, and Moses handed over the tablets to Thomas Jefferson. None of the books actually write that, but many of the books had to distort the influence of Christianity and the Bible and Moses in particular in discussing our founding and our founding documents.
Here's what one of the textbooks says about Moses. There's a chart that's titled, "Where Did the Framers Get Their Ideas?" Moses is at the top of the list, followed by influential Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, Charles de Montesquieu, and William Blackstone. There's actually a picture of Moses with a little bio, and just like there is for the other three guys. Kathy Miller's organization was worried enough about the social studies standards that they commissioned scholars to examine the new textbooks. The scholars saw this chart like a game of one of these things is not like the other on Sesame Street. They felt the justification of Moses' contribution seemed thin and contrived. For example, compared to the Enlightenment thinkers who have an extensive body of writing that is traceable to our founding documents, what are the exact writings of Moses that influenced the framers? In the textbook's little bio of Moses, it says, "During the years of wandering in the desert of Sinai, Moses handed down God's 10 Commandments to the Hebrews." Kathy Miller's scholars felt that it was worded in a way that was very close to endorsing a religious claim. It takes for granted that there is a God, and that God spoke to Moses. The scholars made a number of criticisms of the textbooks, and so did conservative board members, and the publishers went back and revised them. Miller says the final textbooks aren't as bad as the drafts.
The social studies instructional materials that were adopted last year that are going into the classrooms this year are significantly better than the curriculum standards that were adopted, in large part because an overwhelming array of scholars and professors from our colleges and universities made clear to the State Board of Education that our students would have to be remediated in college if they weren't given a better understanding of history and social studies.
But Kathy Miller points out that good textbooks don't necessarily mean good teaching. Texas teachers still have to get students to meet educational standards set by the conservative school board. Otherwise, the kids won't do well in standardized tests.
So there's still a huge question mark about whether or not the improved instructional materials, because they included more information and they opened the door to more critical thinking, will be able to be taught in the classroom when we live in this kind of culture of drilling to the test.
Disputes between organizations like the Texas Freedom Network and conservative groups go way back in Texas. David Anderson is a lobbyist for textbook publishers, and he's seen the same fights over the decades.
The people who are more of the liberal persuasion, the liberal bent, want to tell an unvarnished version of U.S. history, as you say, warts and all. On the other side, what I have observed in very, very genuine and sincere approach from the social conservatives on the board, again, they're looking at what sets the United States apart from the rest of the world. And when you start talking about our flaws, it makes that story more difficult.
Still, Anderson says in spite of those battles, in spite of the educational standards that have caused so much controversy, the new textbooks are really good.
In my opinion, these are the best textbooks that we have seen in social studies in Texas, certainly in my career, and I've been doing this now for almost 43 years.
He says no matter what the standards say, the people who write the textbooks can add more material, more context.
You might have standards that take 100 words that tell this is the lead up to the Civil War, but in the textbook itself, you might have an entire unit with 3 chapters, hundreds of pages on the antebellum South and the lead up to the Civil War.
David Anderson says the fights over history, the same ones we see today, began back in the 1960s.
In the 60s, you began to see pressure being placed on publishers by groups that would have a specific interest. For example,
Anderson says this was a time when various special interest groups like Native Americans, African Americans, Latinos, and women pushed more to have their story represented in the history taught to young people.
As you got into the 60s and more special interest groups began to develop and saw that the textbooks were not presenting a full picture, that's when you began to see some of those groups effectively argue that the books needed to have a different perspective. It was in the 60s that you saw the rise of Mel and Norma Gabler here in Texas, for instance.
Coming up, we'll meet textbook watchdogs Mel and Norma Gabler.
One of the publishers told me about 2 years ago, "We laughed at you every time you stood up. We took you as one big joke." I smiled and I said, "You don't laugh anymore." And he said, "No way, we'd rather face anybody in the nation than you."
I'm Trey Kay, and this is Us and Them, which is supported in part by the West Virginia Humanities Council, the CRC Foundation, and the Daywood Foundation.
Music lifts us up and brings us together, even when we can't get together in person. Mountain Stage brings you live performances on the air, online, and in our podcast. They remind you how it feels to be in a live audience listening to live music. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find a link to our stations and our podcast online at mountainstage.org.
America has a long tradition of citizen activism regarding what kids learn in school, and no one has had a bigger impact than Texans Mel and Norma Gabler. They were worried that special interest groups were rewriting the narrative that traditional America understood. Back in 2013, I produced a radio documentary called The Long Game, Texas's ongoing battle for the direction of the classroom. And in it, I featured a section about textbook watchdogs Mel and Norma Gabler. Here's a portion of that report.
The values which most Americans hold dear have been censored from textbooks. The very values that we need to foster if we want to continue as a moral nation.
Why should a handful of liberals totally control what's going on in our textbooks?
For more than 4 decades, these mom and pop citizen watchdogs played a major role in forcing the Texas education system and the giant national textbook publishing industry to take note of the values of patriotic, conservative Christian parents. In the early 1960s, Mel and Norma lived in Hawkins, a tiny East Texas town, situated around one intersection and the trains that run by. Patsy Cline's I Fall to Pieces had the #1 spot on Billboard's country chart when the Gabler's son Jim was puzzled by his 9th grade history assignment.
What I remember is that I had to learn the Gettysburg Address.
These days, Jim Gabler is in his 60s and lives in Phoenix. He's retired from a career as an IT director in the healthcare business. But back when he was in junior high school, the assignment was to find a source that contained the text of Lincoln's address. He went to the World Book Encyclopedia on his parents' shelf. Inside the volume, he noticed a photo of the famous speech as it is etched into the wall of the Lincoln Memorial. Below the photo, the speech was written out on the page. He compared the two versions.
I noticed that under God was not in the text, but it was in the picture.
Jim showed his parents how the World Book had omitted under God from Lincoln's speech.
That's what triggered them to start taking a look at what was actually in textbooks.
So from their kitchen table in Hawkins, Mel and Norma Gabler launched a textbook reviewing enterprise they called Education Research Analysts. The couple conducted the reviews. Norma read through the books while their boys were at school, and Mel did in the evenings and on the weekends when he wasn't at his clerk job for the Humble Oil Company. The operation was sustained by Mel's income.
And so the Gablers, they developed a very meticulous system for going through the textbooks line by line.
That's William Martin, a professor of religion and public policy at Rice University. He says the Gablers pioneered a metric for religious conservative citizens to measure textbook content.
And as they investigated, they found out that citizens could go to the Texas State Board of Education, which had the textbooks that were under consideration were available to be examined, and then you could testify for them or against them at public hearings.
Norma was the one who'd make the trip to Austin for the Board of Education meetings.
At one meeting, the person that was the chair kind of leaned back and said, "Ms. Gabler, what gives you the right to tell us how we should do our job?" And my mother, to her credit, came up with 3 reasons. And one of them was that they pay taxes, so they pay for the books. They provide the children. And the third reason was the law gives them the mechanism to be there.
One of the publishers told me about 2 years ago, "We laughed at you every time you stood up. We took you as one big joke." I smiled and I said, "You don't laugh anymore." And he said, "No way, we'd rather face anybody in the nation than you."
In 1965, the Gablers moved their family and textbook reviewing operation to a bigger house about 30 miles east in the larger town of Longview.
When we moved there, it was a normal house. Over time, it became harder and harder to find a place to even sit down and so forth.
This was because the textbook reviewing operation literally took over the whole house. Bill Martin visited the Gablers back in the 1980s when he was writing a feature story for Texas Monthly.
Their home was filled with just walking through the hallways. It was just like walking through the corridors, narrow corridors of a warehouse where they had had the books stacked up in their research and 1 or 2 people in there working away.
As the Gablers' reputation grew, textbook authors understood that they were a force to be reckoned with. And sometimes that reckoning might happen face to face.
Yeah, I was a young college professor.
That's Richard Bain, geography professor at Texas State University. I met him for breakfast at his favorite place, Cafe on the Square in the town of San Marcos, where he told me about his early experience of writing geography textbooks.
I had been invited by my publishing company to attend the textbook hearings in Austin with the school board. So, of course, I marched in proud as a peacock because here I was, the author of this textbook. And shortly after I arrived, I found out that of the 9 textbooks that were up for adoption that year, that mine was the one that had been subjected to scrutiny by the Gablers from East Texas.
Bain recalls that 2 of the Gablers' assistants walked forward with something like a large roller of paper towels. One assistant held the roller, and one grabbed the other end and unfurled a scroll of pages taped end to end, about 60 or 70 feet.
And said, "These are the errors that we've found in this geography book." And I'll tell you, if I could squirm down low and get beneath the seats and crawl out of the room, that's what I was thinking about at that particular moment.
Bain learned the hard way what many of Gabler's critics were forced to admit. They were darn good at ferreting out factual errors. ABC News cited some of the mistakes found by the Gablers in books for a social studies adoption.
One book says Napoleon's victories included Waterloo. Actually, Napoleon suffered his most famous defeat at Waterloo. On the Korean War, it says the United States settled the conflict by using the bomb. But an atomic bomb was never used in Korea.
I worked for Mr. Gabler 22 years before he died, and he never tried to hurry me through a project.
That's Neil Fry, a thin, bookish man with thick, horn-rimmed glasses, who used to be a college history professor. He caught many errors for the Gablers over the years. Fry says Mr. Gabler insisted on a meticulous review process because
the only way you can prove that you're not stupid to a secular liberal is to master detail better than they do. And if you master detail better than a secular liberal does, they will respect you. Otherwise, they'll despise you if you don't. But after you show them a few times that you've mastered the details of textbook content and of the textbook adoption process, as well as or better than they have, they will back off and respect you.
Finding factual errors gave the Gablers clout to address other issues, such as choice of content. In one reading anthology, Mel was troubled by some of the story selections.
They were overwhelmingly negative. Maybe 5 or 6 stories on death, or suicide, or cruelty, or morbidness, and so forth.
One of the stories was Shirley Jackson's short story classic, The Lottery, which is about a community stoning ritual passed down from generation to generation. After the Gablers' protests, the State Board of Education told several publishing companies that their anthologies could not be sold in Texas if they included the lottery. But in a way, it didn't really matter what the subject was, because to the Gablers, everything taught in the public schools was tainted by a pernicious religion, called humanism.
The religion in which men have faith in mankind instead of faith in God. And humanism is prevalent in our textbooks from cover to cover in all grades and all subjects.
Since Texas purchased such large quantities of books, the Gablers' book reviews had national implications.
Her name is Norma Gabler, and she is formidable.
Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes interviewed the Gablers back in 1980.
She has been called education's public enemy #1. Who is she? Well, she is simply a housewife, the mother of 3 sons, and a grandmother, too. And though she's never gone to college, when Norma Gabler speaks, the education establishment of the state of Texas listens.
Every child should not have to sit in the classroom and read profanity and gutter language. You have an opportunity to read the textbooks. Go to Austin and tell them what you don't want in the books. It's your money, it's your children, and you have that right.
Wallace asked publishers and academics just how influential the Gablers were.
Tom Murphy is vice president of the textbook division of CBS-owned Holt Reinhardt. Has Murphy's publishing house ever changed material to suit the Gablers?
Yes, we did. They probably have more influence on the use of textbooks in this country than any other 2 people.
In a 10-year period, the last 10 years, they've become more and more of a force for publishers to contend with.
If we want to sell the book, we are either faced with the dilemma of changing the material or not changing the material and taking the risk of not selling the material.
In the 1980s, after the Gablers and other groups protested the teaching of evolution, the Texas Board of Education forced publishers to stamp disclaimers in biology textbooks that read, "Any material on evolution included in this book is clearly presented as theory rather than verified fact." This stamp appeared in textbooks that were used in classrooms across the nation. Mel Gabler died in 2004 and Norma in 2007. Neil Fry continues the Gablers' textbook reviewing work. He and his staff of 3 work out of donated office space in the rear of an old retail store. A trickle of donations keeps the whole operation going.
God is leading us. In hindsight, they said, how did Gablers figure that out? We didn't figure it out. God just made it fall into place.
Things have changed a great deal in the past 5 years or so, and Texas is no longer the 800-pound gorilla that dominates the direction of the textbook publishing industry. This has happened for many reasons. New laws allow Texas school districts to choose their own textbooks rather than using books mandated by the state. There have been changes in customized publishing technology that make it easier to adapt textbooks to each state's standards rather than just issuing one book for the whole country. And perhaps most importantly, most of the states in the nation have signed on to Common Core curriculum standards. And Texas is one of the notable holdouts. States that have signed on to Common Core need textbooks based on those standards, not on Texas's standards. All this means that conservative watchdogs like the Gablers no longer have such an influential position at the forum that determines our nation's textbooks. Still, the Gablers have a lasting legacy. They created a method used by conservatives around the country for challenging textbooks. And this strategy has evolved into other ways of bringing conservative, patriotic Christian values into public schools, like electing conservatives to school boards around the country and having them shape the standards that every child has to know. You have been listening to Us and Them. Our show was written and produced by me, Trey Kay, and Lori Stern. Catherine Winter edited the program, and it was mixed by Chris Julin. Deborah George edited the section about Mel and Norma Gabler. Michael Lipton and Tristan Lozow wrote and performed our show music. Sophia Tedesco is our intern. Rita Krisafi and Marina Trofimova built our website, usandthempodcast.com, and provide us with images for the web. Mark Lerner designed our logo. The wonderful people at West Virginia Public Broadcasting make Us and Them possible. So do grants from the West Virginia Humanities Council and the CRC Foundation. The Mel and Norma Gabler section was made possible by the Spencer Fellowship for Education Reporting at Columbia University's School of Journalism. And thanks to all the folks who have liked our Facebook page or tweeted about our show at Us Them Podcast, or to me at Trey_K on Twitter. And please keep those ratings and reviews coming on iTunes. They're a big, big help. We'll see you next time on Us and Them.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.